In this video, I'm gonna go over some of the basics of how to use off-camera flash in your photography. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If it is your first time here, my name is Matthew. I am an architecture and design photographer based in Kansas City. Now, while personally, I mainly shoot architecture and interiors, most of what I'm gonna talk about when it comes to off-camera flash can directly apply to other genres of photography as well. And we're going to go over just the elemental basics because in my opinion, anything beyond that, it starts to step into the bounds of artistic preference and choice. I get a lot of questions about the specifics of using flash, when to use it, and in what kind of scenarios. But there is no one-size-fits-all answer of how to use flash when shooting architecture or interiors, portraits, weddings. There just isn't, I'm sorry. Once you know how to use it though, beyond that are choices simply based on your preference, style, and taste. This video is for photographers who are fairly fresh and brand new to using off-camera flash altogether. So let's start with the basics as implied by the name, how to get your flash off the camera. And what's the advantage? When you connect a flash like this to the top of your camera, the connections on the hot shoe send a signal to the flash when you're taking the photo. That way the flash fires at the same time that you press the button and the shutter opens. It's pretty simple. Now, in order to start using flash off the camera, you're going to need some kind of wireless remote or transmitter to now place on the hot shoe connection. The transmitter will now send a signal wirelessly to the flash to tell it to fire when you press the shutter button. It's really that simple. So what's the advantage? Well, once you learn off-camera flash, the possibilities are endless. Seriously. If you refuse to learn off-camera flash or are simply too intimidated by it to learn, you are significantly limiting your creative options as a photographer. Have you ever heard someone label, market, or say,
I am a natural light photographer. I only shoot with natural light.
Yeah, that's code for,
I have no idea how to use off-camera flash.
Here's a good example of a big advantage of getting your flash off the camera. Now, when the average person thinks about using flash when taking pictures, they probably think about the flash that's built into the camera itself, or at the very least connected to it. Some of them are pop-up flashes. Most camera phones have a flash built in, and as you saw previously, the flash could be connected on the hot shoe. Here's the problem with that setup though. When your flash is very close to the lens or on the same axis, or I should say, pointed in the same direction that your camera is, when you take your photo, it tends to give your images a flat, dull, and unflattering look. Now, if that's the look you're going for as an artist, great, go for it, all power to you. But because most photographers want to showcase texture, form, and dimensionality of the subjects that they're shooting, it's best to have your primary source of light, and in this case, a flash, it's best to have it hit your subject at a different angle than the direction your camera is facing. We'll look at an example. Here's a fairly simple shot with this iron giant figure as the subject. Now, we're not going to get into the principles around the exposure triangle camera settings just yet. We're gonna touch on that here in a bit. But for this shot, we're starting off with the flash on top of the camera pointed on the same axis or pointed in the same direction that the camera lens is. Now looking at it, the subject is adequately lit and exposed well, but relative to what we could do, this shot is pretty flat and boring. So let's get the flash off the camera. We'll pop on the trigger atop the camera's hot shoe mount, and let's place the flash above the subject at roughly a 45-degree angle instead of just pointed straight on. Check out the difference. Now, we could go down a rabbit hole with all the open lighting possibilities, but honestly, that's a video for another day. This is just meant to demonstrate the why. Why look into or why try to use off-camera flash at all? Okay, so you've made it this far. You're open to the idea of getting your flash off the camera. Now what? The next step is to figure out the different settings on your camera and flash and what they do to your photo overall. And let's start with the simplest of the two, and you may be surprised, but it's the flash. It's actually a pretty simple piece of gear relative to the camera. Now, while there are really expensive flashes with tons of bells and whistles and menus and settings to change and mess with, in reality, all you need is a really basic flash where all you'd really need to change is the power output, or how bright the flash gets, and the spread of the light. That's it. If you want your light to shoot at its brightest at full blast, well, most flashes read that as 1/1. If you want it to shoot at half power, well, that's 1/2. Quarter power, 1/4, you get the idea. And similar to focal length settings on a lens, the millimeter settings on some flashes sets how wide or how narrow the spread of light will go. That's basically all you need to know about a flash. And honestly, units like this and this one here, they don't have the ability to change the spread of light. So the only thing you need to know when using one of these is just to change how bright it goes, the power output of it. All right, flashes aside, now, what about the camera? All right, I am going to try to simplify this as much as possible. If you are familiar with the exposure triangle, that being ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, the only setting on your camera that does not really affect the flashlight is the shutter speed, and here's why. As an example, let's say I set the power output of this flash to 1/4 power. Okay, when this is fired, the burst of light will really only last, and I'm taking a stab at this is kind of a guess, but that burst of light will really only last roughly 1/500th of a second, okay? So keep that in mind. We're gonna create a 1 second timeline and pretend that this little sliver is that 1/500th burst of light. If my camera is set to take a 1 second exposure, and clearly when I press the shutter button, the flash will fire as well, that 1 second exposure is going to capture all the light that fired from the flash. That 1/500th of a sliver, that 1/500th burst of light definitely fits within that 1 second exposure. If I raise the camera's shutter speed to a half second, clearly it will lower the overall ambient light, but the flashlight will remain unaffected because still that 1/500th sliver, that 1/500th of a second burst of light still fits within that half second shutter speed. Even if I raise the shutter speed to 1/100, yeah, the photo overall is going to be much darker now because most of the ambient light is gone, but once again, the flashlight remains the same because that 1/500th burst of light still fits within that 1/100th of a second shutter speed. You can get really creative with this now because you basically have a source of light that you can alter and shape completely independent from the available ambient light with the environment you're shooting. But the other parts of the exposure triangle do affect flashlight too, the same way it affects the ambient light. Open the aperture, that will let more light in. Lower the aperture, that will lower the amount of light that comes in. Raise the ISO, that will brighten the image overall. Lower the ISO, that's going to darken it overall. You get the idea. Let's say you set up a scene at ISO 100 with an aperture at f/14 and a shutter speed of 1/10. You decide you want to add a little flash to this image, but even at full power, you're not getting the amount of light you want from the flash. Are you stuck? No. Novice photographers may look at this scenario and say, my flash, it's just not powerful enough. And that's not really true. If you want to keep your aperture the same at f/14, simply change the ISO and shutter speed accordingly to match the exposure that you were getting with the previous settings. Okay, so why did that work? Well, as we went over, the shutter speed had nothing to do with it. It was the ISO. You made the camera's sensor more sensitive to pick up more of the flash light. Once you know what the camera settings can do to flash light, this is where you can get really creative. You can take photos where all the ambient light is gone and it's just flash that you control. You can take portraits outside and give your subjects a studio lighting look. You can add a subtle amount of flash to an interior design image to give it more of a clean, refined look. The possibilities are endless, seriously. So what do you need to know after this? The next thing to learn is how to modify or alter the quality of light. You could shoot through a softbox, a diffuser, an umbrella, a grid, etc. And I'm not gonna go over those in this video, but honestly, there's a ton of other videos on YouTube going over the advantages and features of each kind of light modifier. Once you know how to use off-camera flash, what you do with it is up to you. Well, that'll do it for this video. Like I said, I was gonna try to keep it pretty basic and simple. If you got anything out of this one, make sure to drop me one of these. If you have a question over anything specific that I mentioned in this video, feel free to leave it in the comments. But if it's a question that gets real specific about scenarios and how to use flash beyond what I mentioned, I just highly recommend doing a search into Google or definitely YouTube. There's probably someone out there way smarter and better than me explaining it. You can follow me on Instagram at Matthew A Photo. If you made it all the way here to the end, I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to watch. That'll do it for this video. We'll see you on the next one.